We now have the opportunity to hear from Paul Reville, and he is coming to us from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And I've heard Paul's presentation before, and it's really, really powerful. And I think this sets a really nice context for our next session where we're going to hear from a business panel. So it's kind of thinking about what was today's theme. It was about linking careers to education, to STEM education. And so as we think about that context of education and what we learn here, then we're going to take it from that application and that career standpoint and start to connect the dots. So without further ado, I introduce Paul Reville. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Very bright lights here, so I can barely see you out there. I've been struggling a little. I just arrived late morning, and this seems as much a food conference as a STEM conference because of all the opportunities for nutrition that are out there. But I'm pleased that I know you've had a long week and a long day, and still I'm impressed that so many of you are here. I'm going to sort of take you on a walk through the education ecosystem as I see it. So it's not strictly a STEM presentation that I'm going to do. I'm going to talk a little bit more broadly about issues of equity and excellence in education more broadly. But I want you to know STEM is near and dear to my heart. My wife is a STEM educator. She heads a program called HMS Med Science, which is part of the Harvard Medical School. And I chair her advisory board, actually, and it's a program about bringing young people from the inner city through a biosciences, a semester-length biosciences curriculum into the Harvard Medical School in a simulation lab and solving problems much as they would if they were a team of emergency room specialists. So I've seen the power of the kind of integrated STEM work that you all are talking about. I just had a session with the District 4 people in New York City that was so impressive. So nice job, guys. I mean, you know, the kinds of things that you're doing, I think, are very much needed and very much speak to where we are at this particular moment in education. I'm going to say something more about this later, but let me just start with this sort of broad theme before I get into some of the equity discussion and systems change discussion that I want to kind of provoke you a little bit with. But I do think we're at a moment in American public education right now where we're kind of stalled out and divided as a field. We've come through a period of 25 years or so of energetic, expensive education reform with a particular theory of action, standards-based school reform. And while we've had some victories and some successes and so forth, we're experiencing now a lot of reform fatigue, a lot of pushback on some of the instruments of reform. People don't like X, Y, and Z set of standards. People don't like the testing. People don't like various forms of evaluation, whether it be of teachers or students that have been done. People have violent disagreements within our field over subjects like charter schools, or bilingual education, or inclusion and special education. We've had so many internecine warfare, so much internecine warfare that we've driven a lot of allies away from the field. As somebody who is very involved in the origins of ed reform, particularly in the state of Massachusetts 25 and 30 years ago, we had a fair consensus back then about what needed to be done, and people were on the same page. Now we have deep divisions. We had a lot of allies then. We had business people. We had governors crawling over one another to be known as the education governor, the education CEO. Now you can find relatively few people from political life or from the world of business who want to be associated with education because of all the deep divisions that tend to alienate customers or constituencies. And so it's a moment, I think, of both peril, because at some level we're abandoned and we don't have a theory of action about where we go from here, and at the same time of opportunity. And particularly for opportunity as described by educators from the field. I think there's a lot of belief that the last round of reform was very much top-down, done to the field, and a belief now that the only kind of reform that's going to have any stickiness or any power will be reform that emerges from the field upward, which is precisely what you're doing. People closest to the customers, people closest to the students and the families, designing ways and means of improving opportunities and improving outcomes, and the field taking the lead instead of reacting to others taking the lead. So I love the call to action spirit of this conference. I love the challenge to you as educators to lead the next generation of reform. And I love the notion that you're talking in integrated ways about this topic, appealing to this notion of deeper learning. I'll talk in a little bit about my colleague, Joe Almeida, who's written a book and had an editorial recently in the New York Times with his colleague in which he was saying, you know, when we want to look for the most successful things in education these days, the things that get the most traction with students, the things that build student energy and motivation and engagement, look to the extracurricular activities, activities that we're actually cutting in many of our school systems due to financial problems. But the characteristics of those activities are the kinds of things that we ought to be incorporating and integrating into the mainstream curriculum, like the news program that I just saw in District 4, where a group of students are doing a weekly news show based on what's going on in their school, or the roller coaster problem that a set of teachers in that school were solving. Ways of getting people hands-on, deeply engaged, solving problems that have relevance and meaning to their lives. And at the same time, address some of the big challenges. As I have thought in the context of Massachusetts about the challenges that we have in the area of STEM education, I see three kinds of gaps that we're deeply concerned about. Number one, what catches our attention is we have huge achievement gaps. We have gaps between those who are competent and skilled and have the knowledge that they need to participate in a 21st century economy in the STEM fields, and those who don't, big gaps. But behind those gaps are invariably opportunity gaps, gaps that some children have access to learn those skills and that knowledge, and other children don't have that access. So we have a big challenge in terms of, if we're going to close achievement gaps, closing opportunity gaps. And again, you folks are talking about how to create opportunities for meaningful engagement with students. And then third, we have this question of inspiration gaps. In Massachusetts, we have an interesting case study of this. We have some of the top scores, if not the top scores, in many of the STEM disciplines in the nation, and in some cases close to the top in the world. But yet when you look at our students and what they indicate, for example, on the SAT, that they're interested in pursuing in college or careers, STEM disciplines score about a standard deviation below average in terms of their interest in these fields. So we've gotten them the skills they need, but we failed to inspire them with the excitement of discovery and the excitement of being involved in the STEM disciplines. And that's really a problem. That's what I love about HMSM Ed Science, is that it inspires people to see themselves in meaningful STEM roles, solving important problems that make a big difference in people's lives. So I think this work of closing achievement gaps, opportunity gaps, and inspiration gaps is right at the center of the work that you're doing, that I've observed STEM educators engaged in over the years. So that is all by way of a prelude, and I want to talk now a little bit in a larger framework about my general analysis of where we are in terms of education reform right now in the United States, and some of the factors, many of which lie outside of the structure of school, that we need to take into account, which is not to say this doesn't tie directly to your work. It is also not to say that it's your responsibility to solve the problems that I'm trying to describe, because I think these are bigger community problems, state problems, national problems that we have to address as a society. But I think it's time for us to give some serious thought to redesigning the whole mechanism of schooling, which is really, after all, our human capital development system, to make it more capable of doing the job that policymakers over the past 25 years have consistently asked it to do, which is the job of educating all students to the level heretofore reserved for the elite few. And my contention is we took a system that was designed in the early 20th century, now 125 years ago, for a very different purpose, which was to batch process, mass produce education for a society that had lots of immigrants coming in from abroad and from the country to urban areas, and getting them to work in factories in low skill, low knowledge, routine jobs, needed a graduation rate of 10%, and 90% of people at a very reduced level of achievement. And since that time, we've taken that system and modified it incrementally, added a kindergarten, added a middle school, added various different features to try and get it to do the job that we needed it to do in the late 20th and early 21st century. And the engine that we're trying to redesign for that purpose is just too limited in its current structure. So I think it's up to us as educators, again, to take the lead in helping policymakers and opinion leaders reconceptualize what it is we need if we're going to have a human capital development system of which schooling is at the center, that actually and truly prepares all of our children, and all means all, to be successful in a 21st century economy, in a 21st century democracy, in family life, and in lifelong learning. So this is how I sort of approach and think about this. Horace Mann, the first secretary, I was Secretary of Education in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts with Governor DeVal Patrick. But the first Secretary of Education in the United States was also from Massachusetts. And he said in the late 19th century that education ought to be the great balance wheel in our society. He had a radical idea that if we had a common school and we invited everybody into the common school, irrespective of race, ethnicity, religion, gender, social class, and gave them a common quality education, then we would have, once they graduated, a meritocracy, and talent and effort would rise to the top. Now, the concept of a common school was radical in itself, a school to which we'd invite everybody instead of just a privileged few. That was a radical, important, good idea. But the idea that school by itself was going to be enough to put everybody on a level playing field hasn't proved out over time. It may have proved out a bit more a century ago than it has now. But right now, schooling does not predict actually how successful you're going to be. Here's a graph that appeared on the front page of the New York Times a couple of years ago. It's the work of Sean Reardon, who works at Stanford. It's a straight line correlation, and if you can see it on the screen from the far left hand, the horizontal axis goes from poorer communities to wealthier communities. The vertical is from 3 grades ahead of grade level in terms of achievement to 3 grades behind. And each of those lavender circles is one of the 14,500 school districts in the United States adjusted for size. So what you see here is the reality of America. It's the reality actually of most other nations and of most jurisdictions within our country, which is there's a straight line, iron law correlation between socioeconomic status and educational achievement and attainment. This is a bit like looking at the sun. We don't like to look at it, we don't like to talk about it, but this straight northeast line says, not for everybody, it's not a stereotype, it isn't true for everyone, but in general, the chances that you'll attain at high levels in education are best predicted by where you started life and the socioeconomic status of your community. And that's not what education in America is supposed to be about generally. That is not what education reform was supposed to be about. It was supposed to be about no child left behind. Every student succeeds. Every child a winner. All means all. And we haven't gotten there. Now, it's clear that on any vertical axis that you look at in this diagram, there are schools that are doing extraordinarily well, way above average. and some that are doing very poorly in spite of the resources or background. Just as we know in the case of individuals, demographics don't predict success for any particular individual. We have many individuals, including, I'm sure, many in this room, who've triumphed over the odds. But the macro data tells the story. Iron law correlation between socioeconomic status and educational achievement and attainment. That's what we set out to change in education reform, and arguably, we've not been able to do it. And we set out to change it because we had this idea from a policy perspective that it was important to the future of our society and our economy to accomplish that task of all means all. And we haven't accomplished it. And so we're still, in my view, a nation at risk. So what's our recent journey been? We had aspirational goals, and I've just mentioned them, of equity and excellence, which we've always had for education. We equated individual success with societal prosperity. We wanted to eliminate the correlation between demographics and destiny. We truly wanted to get to all means all. It was thought to be not only in the interest of each individual, but in the interest of society. Our strategy for getting there as a society was, let's optimize the current model of schooling that we've inherited from the early 20th century. Let's take school as we know it, not make fundamental boundary changes. For example, look at the question of time. We've not changed the amount of time devoted to school in the past 25 years, except perhaps incrementally at the edges. We're still, for the most part, 180 days a year, somewhere between 6 and 7.5, 8 hours a day. Even though each state can do it its own way, we're remarkably similar across the country. And this intervention called schooling amounts to 20% of a child's waking hours. So we're expecting a 20% intervention in the lives of children to overcome compounding, growing inequality in income and assets in our society. We're expecting it to triumph over decreasing social mobility, and for the most part, it's proved not a strong enough intervention. Even if you could optimize the current model of schooling, for the most part, it hasn't proved to be a strong enough intervention. Our theory of action in ed reform was if we improve our schools through systemic reform, we'll increase student learning for everyone and achieve both excellence and equity while preparing both individuals and society to prosper in the future. And we engaged in a bunch of strategies about which there was a fair amount of consensus, a consensus that I described earlier that we've completely lost right now. There are many, many different theories of action about where we need to go from here now, and there isn't any kind of unity at top-level policy circles, which is why, for example, you don't hear candidates running for office these days or in the last presidential election in either party willing to talk about education. We've got no agreement on policies. In fact, we've got deep divisions. But in those days, in the early 90s, there was a fair amount of consensus coming out of the education summits that the first President Bush ran and President Clinton ran. Standards, assessment, accountability, focus on data, focus on teaching, interjection of some school choice, and attention to chronically underperforming schools. At Harvard, we have a model for thinking about school reform, and at the center of that model, I don't know if you can read it easily from here. I'm going to have a cough drop from my voice. But at the center is a triangle that features a student, teacher, and a curriculum. And the notion behind this conception of ed reform is what really matters, the core business of education, is that transaction between student, teacher, and curriculum. And what all education reform ought to be designed to do is to optimize that transaction. And what I'm arguing in my remarks with you today, the provocation that I want to make with you today is to say, in education reform, we actually did a pretty good job about thinking about how we could improve teaching. Who do we attract in? How do we prepare them? How do we induct them? How do we provide professional development? How do we compensate, evaluate, supervise, so forth? Thank you very much. That will help too. Teachers in doing that work. So we made good progress on We worked hard on curriculum. God knows we argued at length about Common Core standards and in each of our states, our own state standards, and then rolling out curriculum to help teachers address those standards while giving a certain amount of freedom in the classroom for people to take many roads to Rome to get to those goals we were trying to achieve. So we paid adequate attention to teachers, we paid adequate attention to content, but we kind of took the student part of the equation for granted. We said, they are what they are. We get the students we get, and we have to deal with them as they come to us, which was fair at one level, but also disregarded at another level the conditions of their lives in the 80% of their waking hours that they spend outside of school. And without taking into account the huge differences and variations in how students show up and what their experience is outside of school, inevitably giving everybody, even at best, an equal treatment would not get them to the same place. Case in point, when I was Secretary of Education, I used to visit kindergartens on the first day of school in September. And when you go into these kindergartens, you'd see kids who are basically 2 or 3 years behind reading readiness in kindergarten, and at the same time, in the same room, kids who are 2 or 3 years ahead. You'd know from the literature that some of these kids have heard 50,000 fewer words, 50 million fewer words, than other kids by the time they hit that age. So there are radical differences in where they came from and where they were at the point of entry. And if you look at the research and divide those kids into cohorts going forward from kindergarten, you'd see that in the 13 years of school, there's very little movement between those cohorts. In other words, in some senses, the race is over before it even begins. So we need to think more deeply, more longitudinally. We need to start earlier, and we need to work more holistically in addressing the differences that children bring with them in their life's experience as they come to school, and we try to find the point at which we can motivate, engage them to supply that critical ingredient in educational success known as effort. So it isn't for lack of spending. We spend a lot of money in education reform in the United States. This just takes it up to 2002. You see in the bottom blue bar, NAEP scores, average NAEP scores, while you see in control dollars, 2002 dollars, how much we've increased our spending. So the productivity in the world of education has not been great. We're proud of what we've accomplished in Massachusetts. I worked hard on this. But I always said when we were in office, the celebration ought to be a short one. Doing well isn't anywhere near good enough. Despite all these first place finishes, we've got huge achievement gaps between our top performing and lowest performing students that are larger than most other states in the country. So all these first place finishes are based on averages. And caught up in those averages, in those achievement gaps that I mentioned earlier, are lots of kids, many of them low-income, students of color, students who don't speak English as their first language, students with disabilities. We are leaving far too many children behind. And this shows some of those gaps. These are lines based on income. Here are lines adjusted for economic disadvantage, disabilities, English language learning status. And they're all, to begin with, relatively flat, and the gaps stay relatively constant, despite of an education reform movement that consumed a lot of money and a lot of energy on the part of teachers, principals, students, and their families. Here are the 17-year-old NAEP scores, Latino, white, and African American, NAEP reading scores. We have not busted the chart in anything that happened as a result of education reform, but certain things stay constant. Here's just another version of that northeast line I showed you in the very early graph, which basically says the higher your income, the better you're going to do on SATs. And we've seen a lot of scandals recently about people going into criminal activity in order to get their kids into college. But beneath the criminal activity are all kinds of perfectly legitimate, legal, and time-honored practices that enable those with social capital, those with financial capital, those with wealth and opportunity to use that opportunity to advantage their children in the race to college and career. So, education reform set out to achieve all means all, but there's still this iron law correlation. We have failed at one of the central missions of our education reform work. And why is this more important now than ever before? Well, you know the answer to this. The demographics of our population are changing. The students by ethnicity and race are now the majority in U.S. public schools. Low-income students are now a majority in U.S. public schools. These are groups with which we've historically been less than successful. They're now the new majority. If we fail to be successful with them going forward, we jeopardize our future as a nation, not just our economy, but our democracy, our way of life, the whole notion of a middle class in America. All of that's at stake. So this that you're working on is an urgent problem that needs attention, and it needs reconceptualization. It's not just tinkering with that Model T that we inherited, but it's building a Tesla for the 21st century. So the problem has many facets and features. One of them is poverty. We have an education system, a human capital development system. We as educators sometimes shy away from talking about the topic of poverty for fear that we're stereotyping, or that we're speaking in deficit model terms, or that we're making it seem like demographics equal destiny, or we're making excuses for our own performance, or we're even diminishing. Ever since the Coleman Report, educators have been skeptical about explanations of poverty for fear that it's going to make it look like schools aren't important, and then society will further disinvest in schooling. So one of the challenges is to take into account poverty. Another challenge is to recognize that we have a system that's one size fits all. And one size doesn't fit all, as we all know from our experience in our own families if you have multiple children, let alone in our own classrooms. So we've got to have a system that differentiates. I often say if we were doing in medicine what we're doing in education, we'd open a hospital and have everybody who comes to the hospital, irrespective of their ailment, get the same treatment and the same length of stay. And we'd say we're doing it this way because it's convenient for us. And we hope that in general it will contribute to the public health, but we know it won't work for everybody ideally. Well, that's what we're doing in education. It wouldn't last in medicine for 2 days. Not that medicine is the epitome of efficiency and effectiveness in our society, but it's not working much better in education. So behind all our unequal outcomes are income-based gaps in opportunities and life experiences. And if we can't figure out a way as a society, again, not just schools can't do this by themselves, but if we don't figure out a way to close these opportunity gaps, support and opportunity that students receive outside of school, then we have no hope of closing the achievement gaps. These days, social capital, your access to the norms and values that guide behavior, to your family and social networks, increasingly control access to opportunity, which should be in the middle. That blue line is opportunity. You know, this is internships, this is part-time jobs, this is after-school learning, this is summer travel, this is summer learning, this is mental health support, this is adequate nutrition, stability, and so forth. Increasingly, your social capital controls your access to opportunity to develop human capital, and human capital is what you sell on the market. So we have growing inequality and diminishing social mobility. This graph shows when you were born and the chances that you have of exceeding your parents' income over time. And it's gone steadily down. School reform by itself is insufficient to getting the job done. So that's the basic conclusion. The nation is still at risk. I've mentioned that. In my view, we need a new vision of a much more comprehensive, holistic system that meets children where they are in early childhood and gives them what they need inside and outside of school in order that they be successful along their entire trajectory through the education system and emerge with some level of post-secondary education, ready to be successful as workers, citizens, family heads, and lifelong learners. And this is what I mentioned earlier, the moment of opportunity. We've got a stall in the field of education, a lot of disillusionment with reform, a lot of resistance and pushback. We've lost many allies. We have a new federalism that is pushing this down to the local level. And we have ESSA that creates a lot of opportunities, and an administration in Washington right now that is just not focused on education and human capital development. So my belief is there's a lot of opportunity at the local level. Bruce Katz at the Brookings Institution has written a book, and I won't go through because I'm running out of time, this quote, but it basically says, the best prospects for solving long-term difficult problems, notwithstanding the many differences we have in our society, is to start at the local level. And we need a new social compact. We need to reframe communities' commitments to families and children. We need a children's agenda. We need to say that in each of our communities, before we send children to school, there's a platform of support, think healthcare, nutrition, stability, safety, clean air, clean water, that ought to be a human right, that is a prerequisite to children showing up at school ready to learn. And in exchange, we need to ask families to do more to support their children in the process of learning. But we've got to give families those basic foundations that make it possible for each and every child to show up each and every day ready to learn. And this is our aim. I've mentioned that several times. The vision is for a cradle-to-career insulated pipeline. We have formal systems. We have an early childhood system. It's not free and available to everyone. We have a K-12 system, which is open access. We have a post-secondary system, which isn't open access. But assuming we can get full access and affordable access to that system, then wrapping around that, we ought to put the kinds of supports that fill up that 80% of children's lives with the supports and opportunities that those of us who have privilege routinely provide to our own children. But we ought to have public systems that make it possible for those not fortunate enough to inherit social capital through the accident of birth, have access to that support, not just because it's a moral obligation to do that, but because they need it if they're to be successful in school. And this is just another version of the same cradle-to-career pipeline. So I'm submitting that this is the design challenge that we have to look at. And I'm nearly out of time, so I'm going to skip through these next slides relatively quickly. But we've set up a laboratory at Harvard to work with a handful of communities. And how do you build the architecture of support and opportunity that would in turn make it possible for families to succeed and kids to come to school ready to learn? How do we change the national conversation on education reform? I've just published a book with a colleague, Elaine Weiss, called Broader, Bolder, Better, how communities and schools come together to make it possible for children to deal with the disadvantages of poverty. How do we do this work of supporting kids more effectively than we have in the past? What's the role of schools, and what's the role of the rest of the community? And this just talk, we work in communities from Oakland, California to Providence, Rhode Island, and help mayors. We see this as a mayoral problem, not a school superintendent problem. So mayors convene children's cabinets to come together, all the folks in leadership roles who are interested in the health, well-being, and success of children around a table to set goals, gather resources, promulgate strategies, evaluate their work, hold themselves accountable, and make progress in furthering the well-being of children in their communities. So we've done that in a number of places. In the city of Salem, I'm not going to go through these slides because I want to get to something later on down here. We've instituted something called success plans. And this is an idea that, think of the medical record in the medical analogy I used. Think of what we have done in special education with the IEP without the litigiousness associated with that. We need to begin breaking down the one-size-fits-all model by developing a portfolio on each child going forward almost from birth that keeps track of what are that child's assets, strengths, and needs, and how are we as an adult community, not just the schools, coming together to meet those needs. And so we've been working in a handful of communities in putting together a portfolio, this kind of running record, and bringing people to the table to provide solutions as to how you do it. And if you go to our website, redesign.org, you can see a full report and a toolkit on how to do some of this work. These are some of the principles in putting together a plan like that. In the end, no one should be guaranteed success, but everyone should have a fair chance to succeed. In America right now, that's just not the case. And it's up to us as educators to lift our heads up from the day-to-day work and the urgency of the task and the young people and families in front of us and say, in addition to doing our daily work, what does a broader, bolder system look like that meets every child where he or she is and gives them what they need to succeed? So that's what we need to be working on. And finally, in closing, I just say, as this applies to STEM education, I think this challenge of deeper learning is at the forefront right now. This challenge of making the work that goes on in schools more relevant, more rigorous, more engaging for our students, having them solve real-world problems that have resonance for them and connection to the world outside so they see themselves in that world outside. Appealing to their motivation. I used to say as secretary, the largest problem we had in high schools in Massachusetts was boredom. We have far, far too many children just shuffling through the motions because nothing that they're doing has meaning or hopefulness for them in terms of the future. And I think what the kinds of work that you're engaged in here speaks directly how to deepen that learning. And again, my colleague, Jal Maida, has written an excellent book on that called Deeper Learning. I think you've got enormous potential as educators to influence the mainstream. Not just how do we do this in the STEM disciplines, but how do we do this in history? How do we do this in English? How do we do this in civics and economics and other areas where our students need to be engaged, need to be learned, and yet don't see the relevance of stepping up and learning those things. I think we've got opportunities, and you've got the opportunity to lead in terms of helping communities figure out how to structure out-of-school learning. We know that summer learning makes a difference. Those who have it surge forward, those who don't fall back. And yet we still treat it as an accident of birth. Some people have access to summer learning, some don't. And we shrug our shoulders and say, well, that's just the way it is. But we've got to advocate for that to be an entitlement, not an accident of birth. And then finally, I think we've got a great opportunity. I know I'm going to be followed by a panel of employers to bring our employers back to the world of education without engaging them in the political fights that they're so anxious about, but rather to engage them in what they're most interested in, which is having the human capital that enables them to grow and develop their businesses. And they're deeply interested in that, and that work should begin as early as middle school, and engaging, as I know a number of you are, the employer community in helping to shape curriculum and experiences in education, breaking down the borders between schools and the world of work, I think is an enormous opportunity for STEM educators now. So I'm out of time. I want to leave you just with the final thought that I don't think that there's any more important work in our time for the prosperity, for the survival, for the future of our economy and our democracy and our nation than the work that you're doing. But this work is broader than just you. It's not just STEM educators, it's the other educators. It is the communities and the families in those communities, the leaders of those communities. But this is a moment for those of us who are educators at the ground level to take and play a leadership role. And so you've got that opportunity, and I hope that you seize it, and I would love the opportunity to work with you on that. Thank you very much for your time and attention and for your service.